Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jon Gould, the Dean of the School of Social Ecology. Let me welcome you to the University of California, Irvine. For those of you who don't know much about our school, just think of it as a college of social and public policy. Not only do we study societal problems, we try to solve them. And frankly, if there is any time where there have been a lot of social problems or societal problems that require addressing, it would be now. Although I suppose, if you think about it, every generation likes to think that it lives in unprecedented times. But in many ways, I think we really are in them. At a national level, partisans not only can't fund the federal government, but it seems at times like they can't even be in the same room with one another. The president's called a despot by one side. He responds with an AI video of himself wearing a crown. Legislators and private citizens are shot simply for their own views. Even here in Orange County, one of the nation's few purple counties, that's right, of the top 25 counties in America, only 3 of them are truly purple. We are one of them, where Republicans, Democrats, and independents live and work with one another. Even here, people are dissatisfied, they're angry, they're scared. We do polling in the School of Social Ecology, and over the last several years, we found that 2/3 of OC residents believe that the nation's on the wrong track. Similar numbers say that the state is on the wrong track. Both the left and the right believe that the nation and our people have lost our way. And I gotta say, I see it right here on campus as well. I'm teaching a course this quarter, to undergraduates, a course on California's future. And yesterday, this was literally yesterday in class, I asked the students, how many of you believe in the promise of America? This is a class of about 50 students. 4 held their hands up. Now keep in mind, this is a class of students who are either largely the grandchildren or the children of immigrants or themselves immigrants. This is our future. And less than 10% believed that the promise of America was still there, that the hope for the American dream was still alive. So something needs to be done, and it needs to be done now. At a minimum, at a very minimum, we have to find a way to be able to talk across difference, to talk to one another, to have dialogue, even in a time of disruption. And so today's event begins that process for us in the School of Social Ecology as we inaugurate a series of events in which we're going to bring leading thinkers and practitioners together to offer different takes on pressing matters that concern us all. Now, I should emphasize, we're not aiming for easy consensus. These are big-ticket issues. We're not aiming for consensus. What we want to do is to foster exposure to differing perspectives. We want to see respectful conversation across divides, something that many of us of a certain age remember in days gone by. We need to get back to that point. We also want to see, maybe, can we inspire a few aha moments? Now, I know that all sounds very, very serious, because it is, but we're also trying to bring a little bit of a lighter touch to the discussions, because even in stressful times, we believe that an open mind, a willingness to laugh a little, and especially here at a university, a commitment to learning can really move us all forward. We're very fortunate to begin that series today in partnership with the Aspen Institute for this event and with the support of Orange County philanthropist Dr. Kenneth Kim. We thank them both for allowing us to get this process rolling. And the question before us tonight in the panel that we're about to hear from is about our nation's identity, about our identity crisis. In a time of shifting demographics, political divides, and technological disruption, what's it mean for there to be an American identity? How should we understand American pluralism these days? Well, as I said, we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts from across the country who are going to help us to answer that question. I'm going to introduce them all, and as I introduce each of you, if you wouldn't mind coming up on stage and picking up your mic and having a seat, we'll start with Shamil Idris, who's the CEO of Search for Common Ground, which is the world's largest peace-building organization with more than 850 staff. 32 countries, and the organization was nominated for the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize. He has advised global leaders, including serving as Deputy Director of the UN Alliance of Civilizations, and was recognized by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. He's a frequent speaker on conflict resolution and social impact. Idris has delivered keynote talks at the Skoll Foundation, TEDx, and the Global Philanthropy Conference, and we are delighted to have you here with us this evening. Next up is Erica D. Smith. Oh, sorry. Wow. If there's one thing you should know as a dean, it's never step on your guest's applause line. So thank you all for that. Next up is Erica D. Smith, who's a politics and policy columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. She covers the West Coast. A former Los Angeles Times columnist, she has written extensively on racial and economic justice, and she was part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team that exposed racist remarks by LA City Council members. Before this, she held positions at the Sacramento Bee, the Indianapolis Star, where my mother grew up, and the Akron Beacon Journal. She's also a recipient of the Sigma Delta Chi Award for column writing. Thank you very much for joining us as well. Our next panelist is Mona Charen, the policy editor at The Bulwark and host of the Mona Charen Show podcast. Try saying that 3 times fast. In that podcast, she brings thoughtful analysis to today's political and cultural debates. She's a longtime political writer and commentator, and she's known for her principled, fact-driven perspectives on public affairs. Welcome to you as well. Our moderator is someone who is well known to those of us in the School of Social Ecology. Mike Madrid is a nationally recognized political consultant and a leading expert on Latino voting trends whose work has helped shape major campaigns across the country for more than 3 decades. He was a co-founder of the Lincoln Project and is author of the book, The Latino Century, which I highly recommend you read. He has pioneered strategies in Latino communications and outreach that have influenced elections at every level. He currently serves as a senior fellow here at the School of Social Ecology at UC Irvine, and he is the founder of the Latino Working Class Project. Mike, I will hand you the mic, and thank you very much for taking us through this.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here, joining us today. I feel, as you might imagine, completely unqualified to be moderating this panel. But as Jon said, the point of this conversation is really to tap into some of the people who are thinking about some of the bigger picture issues and challenging what America is, what it should be, what it has been, and what its potential is. And so we're looking a little bit less for a debate on ideas and looking more for how each of these people think. And I've had the opportunity to kind of meet some of them, work with some of them, admire some of them from afar. But without further ado, I'm going to jump into some of these bigger picture questions. Towards the end, we will allow for some interaction because we want you to be as engaged as possible and offer up what your ideas are. I'm under no false illusion that this will be hopefully one of the first discussions that you all will be a part of as we enter this next year of America's 250th birthday celebration, when we do ask, where have we been? Where were our best moments? What were our worst moments? Where are we at right now? And what does that look like as we head into the future? And with that, I'm going to begin my question, first one to Mona. In large part, one of the reasons why I was really excited about having Mona on this panel was because we've had some similar backgrounds. Our career trajectory, our thinking process. Mona worked in the Reagan administration, worked for my political hero, Jack Kemp. Things have changed since we were involved in the Republican Party. I'm going to ask a very big, perhaps so big unfair question, Mona, but I'm sure you're going to be able to handle this okay. If you were to send a message to Mona in 1989 when the wall came down and said, this is a message from 2025. This is who America is, and this is maybe what we missed over the course of the next few years, what would that message be? And I'm sure you'd have to send it by fax probably back then. So go ahead and tackle that with me.
So if I understand your question correctly, and by the way, thank you for the invitation. Lovely to be here in beautiful Southern California with all of you. Thank you. If I understand your question correctly, what you're saying is that in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, it was a glorious moment for the world. It was the culmination of decades of bipartisan policy and sacrifice on the part of Americans for liberty. We saw ourselves in many ways, not just internationally, but domestically. How we viewed ourselves and our identity was defined by that Cold War. If you'll recall, and I'm sure Erica knows this, back in the Cold War, race relations in the United States became an international embarrassment because the Soviet Union was always using the fact that we didn't treat members of our own community equally or well as part of their claim that we were not as a society that should be admired or emulated. And so this had an effect, and we got embarrassed and went about trying to reform those aspects of our society. Obviously, it's imperfect, but it was a very, very strong effort. And there were other ways in which the Cold War helped to give us definition. Because we had an enemy that denied people's right to worship, that denied people's right to own property, that lied incessantly, that had guard towers and would shoot people who attempted to leave the country. Because we saw ourselves as in contrast to that, as against all those things, it reinforced that we were the people of liberty. Ronald Reagan, in his farewell address to the nation, tells the story of a U.S. Navy ship that picked up these Vietnamese boat people in the South China Sea who were fleeing that regime, and that when they saw the Americans, they didn't speak very much English, but they said, "Hello, freedom men." And that concept of us as being the nation that stood for freedom, individual rights, human rights, free markets, freedom of religion, all of that was very unifying. I mean, we did have severe differences internally, of course, about how much taxes should be and lots of other things, affirmative action, abortion, of course. But but the Cold War did us a favor in some ways in helping us to develop a self-concept. And when it ended, all of the old internal fissures began to reassert themselves. And you saw a fading of that concept of ourselves as being the good guys. And instead, you started getting a much different message, a message of, well, we've been ripped off by our NATO allies, and so on and so forth. And so I do think that it has, that the end of the Cold War represented a serious challenge to our self-concept that we haven't yet been able to recover from.
So how much does American identity require a foreign enemy?
So a lot of people thought in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union that there was going to be this effort to find another enemy, because after all, how else would we feel united? We're a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural country, And the only way that we can find unity, this argument went, is to have an enemy. And so a number of people were saying, well, China's good. Let's make China the enemy. But that didn't really happen. And I do think, look, I mean, it is true that nations do unite in the face of a foreign threat. But it is also, it takes a terrible price. If you have to fight a foreign foe because it threatens you, then you do what you must do. But if you shouldn't go abroad looking for fights just because that will help your internal unity. That's illegitimate. And we have to find sources of unity homegrown and not look for enemies to artificially provide them.
Erica, that's a great segue. A few weeks ago, the President of the United States and the Secretary of War convened an unprecedented meeting of top generals and admirals from throughout the globe with the clear message from the President of the United States, which was to prepare for one of the main threats to our country being domestic enemies. Now, during this time of extraordinary change, this great transformation of America and the globe, one change that is happening that is unprecedented is the fact that within 10 to 12 years, it is anticipated that we will become a non-white majority country for the first time in our history. That fact alone, combined with changing social behaviors, a more blended society, changing voting patterns, the whole idea of what being a minority seems to be changing. Or is it? And I ask because in your role, covering for Bloomberg the changing demography of this country and what that means, your work in covering some of the conflict between different constituencies of people of different races and ethnicities has brought about, I think, a renewed consciousness of who Americans are, how other groups of Americans view Americans as American or not. And so your simple, quick question with that long wind-up is the idea of being a minority in America changing, and where is it heading?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's going to be a great conversation, and for that very simple question. You know, I do think that it is changing, but I also, this is kind of a cop-out, but I think it's also staying the same. I think that, to your point, Mona, about kind of this external force, you know, I think for minorities in this country, I think it's being the minority in the backdrop of the majority that has given folks an identity, right? I think you can look back even, 4 or 5 years to 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement. It was fighting against a majority, systemic racism, things that are happening to us that we are fighting against. When in that, I don't think that us and them hasn't changed, but I do think that the them looks very different, or looks somewhat different after the election last year. I mean, you talked a little bit about the conflict between minority groups. We saw Latino voters turn and vote for Donald Trump, number of black voters as well, but not at high as rate. And I do think there was some, resentment there between black and brown, that it already existed, and that kind of exacerbated that a little bit. I think thinking back to that time, for me as a black woman, I was a little bit kind of disoriented, particularly as a journalist writing about all of this stuff. But what's happened since the election has kind of reinforced, I think, what a lot of people who were very wary of Donald Trump, particularly when it comes to his treatment of minority groups in this country, it's kind of reinforced that. We've seen, to your point about the generals, and kind of this idea of treating cities and minority groups as enemies to be rooted out as opposed to fellow Americans. And so in that way, I do think there is maybe almost a new solidarity of being like, oh, we are kind of fighting against an us versus them. Then maybe in November of 2024, people thought, well, maybe I can do this, maybe it's not so much of an us. I think that what's happened in the last 4 or 5, or I guess 8 months, or 10 months, what is October now, has reinforced this idea that there is an us versus them in this country, unfortunately. But there's still conflict within minority groups, right? I think that people think, to your point, people think of what it means to be a minority in this country very differently. I think that, you know, what has happened over the last 20 years is people have been able to see themselves as not just limited by the color of their skin or their gender or their sexual orientation or their gender identity. They want to be seen as fully human, which is natural. I mean, we're Americans, we want that. And I think there's a resentment when government continues or people in power continue to treat you as if you are just limited by those things. So there's kind of a natural tension there where people want to be celebrated for who they are, but they also just don't want to be limited by who they are. And what does that look like when it comes to power in this country? What does it look like when it comes to attainment of goals? Looking at the way Black voters in particular went in the last election, you know, at first there was, I think I mentioned a little level of shock, but, you know, looking back, I covered when, up in Los Angeles, when Karen Bass ran for mayor. A lot of the same divisions that I heard on the street talking to voters is a lot of the same stuff that I heard when, you know, when Kamala Harris jumped into the race. There is tension, not just among race and ethnicity, but also among gender and how women are seen. And so these divisions still exist. I think we're working them out in kind of a new paradigm under Trump. I think a different paradigm was at work probably in late 2024. Now, in some ways, we're back to what was previously that, where there is more of an us versus them. But those feelings that people had in 2024 where they want to be seen differently, they saw a taste of what it means to be seen differently. People still want that, and that just doesn't go away because of Trump is in office.
So I'm going to ask you a slight variation of the follow-up question I asked Mona, which is, does identifying as a racial minority in America require a common threat from a white majority?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think that, I guess we're about to find out. I think that, you know, I think Black Americans, just by sheer numbers, that's not going to be a question that we're going to have to answer more or less. But I think that for Latinos, for example, that's going to be a different thing. And what does a minority group, you know, just even being in California, you know, a quote unquote minority state, what does that look like when you are in power in terms of numbers, but not in power in terms of political power? Personally, I think a minority group is always going to feel like a quote-unquote minority group if you don't have power, if you don't have political power, if you don't have power over your own destiny, and you feel that other groups or other people are kind of determining or limiting what that destiny can be. So as long as that is still the dynamic in America, I think minority groups are always going to feel like minorities.
And I am going to get back to you on sort of where we first started our dialogue together, which was on the tensions between Black and brown power structures and what that means. And you've done Pulitzer Prize level work on that, so you're the right person to ask. But first, I'm going to move to our Nobel-nominated peacemaker, Shamil, who oversees an organization that sees conflict, violent conflict, all over the globe and has been involved in that work for some time. Can you give us a measure, Shamil, of where America stands compared to a lot of the countries that you see devolving into civil strife and violent conflict? And if there are any hints or clues as to what common identity could mean to either exacerbate or solve that problem.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for having me. And to Dr. Kim, who's a mutual friend, for having me. And it's great to be, particularly with these panelists. You know, Americans aren't alone in this feeling of fracturing and increasing polarization and us versus them identity. I think it was the Carnegie Corporation, no, it was the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that did, I think, one of the more robust research projects looking at the levels of polarization in every region of the world dating back to 1900. And by polarization, this is a term that's really fuzzy. It's one of the most qualified terms because people call it effective polarization, toxic polarization. And part because it's just not defined clearly. So the definition that they use, and it's increasingly used in our field, is really when one side sees the other. There are two sides, and one side sees the other as an existential threat. So, when you define it that way, there's no such thing as positive polarization. It's not like, hey, leading up to the elections, you want to polarize so you know your choices. Well, not if you see the other side as literally an existential threat, because that's the step before seeing violence, not only as an option, but perhaps as a necessity. And so what they found is that every region of the world, every single region of the world, with the exception of Europe leading up to World War II, is at the highest level of polarization, with the exception of the South Pacific. We all know we should already move to the South Pacific, we'd be happier. But, and that over the last 20 years, every single region of the world, with the exception of Europe before World War II, was experiencing the most rapid increase in polarization that they'd ever experienced over a 20-year period. So the United States, first of all, to your question, is not alone in this sense of heightening polarization and conflict. By other measures, there's a group, Australian-based group called the Institute for Economics and Peace, which puts out this Global Peace Index every year, and you'll see it. It's always published in The Economist, and then it sparks discussions, and, oh, why did this country go up 2 notches and this one fell? The United States fell more places on the Global Peace Index last year or the year before than any country has ever fallen since they've been doing the Global Peace Index. Now, the United States was at a higher stability rate than many of the other countries, but yet the rapidity of the decline was marked by that measure. And I think, one of the things that we look at, several years ago, we developed a framework that's now being used by some governments, state governments in the US, national governments, some UN agencies, and dozens of organizations that tries to understand what should we be measuring, to answer your question? How do we know, how bad is it? Is this as bad as it feels? And one of the big shifts in the healthcare industry that was really critical was when it moved from treating people with disease to actually preventing disease, helping people understand what is a healthy lifestyle so we can keep you out of the emergency room rather than just treating you once you come stumbling in, right? But we haven't had that kind of perspective on how to keep a society healthy, right? One of the pillars in that medical shift was identifying what are the vital signs of a healthy human being. And what are the ranges that you want to see those vital signs in? And there's enough consensus now that if you go to a doctor pretty much anywhere in the world, the first thing they're going to do is it's the same 5 vital signs everywhere, your pulse and your pain levels, et cetera. And we believe that the 5 vital signs of a healthy society, and by healthy, I don't mean all good things. There would be a lot more than 5. It was, what are all the things you'd like to live with? Specifically, when your society hits a crisis, when there's a pandemic, when there's an earthquake, when there's a political assassination, whatever, there'll always be when it hits a crisis, is this a society that's likely to hold, maybe even rally together? Or is this a society that's likely to pull apart in polarization or even turn on each other in civil conflict? And the 5 vital signs that we look at everywhere are the following. The first is intercommunal trust. Black, white, Muslim, Jewish, in other contexts, Sinhalese, Tamil, Hutu, Tutsi, whatever the dividing lines are in your society, generally, what's the level of trust across those dividing lines, right? The second is the level of institutional legitimacy. Do people trust the institutions that govern and serve them? Do they trust the police? Do they trust the CDC during the pandemic? Do they trust the judiciary? It doesn't have to be government. Do they trust the media? So what level of trust is there in the institutions that govern and serve us? The third is levels of physical violence, because violence begets more violence. Are people safe physically? The fourth is hugely subjective. It's people's sense of agency. Do people feel like they can make any difference in their future, their children's well-being, their community's health, et cetera? And the fifth is resourcing. Where is society's budget? What's the budget going to? Is it going towards more prisons, more guns, more top-down controls, the kinds of investments that reflect that conflict has already gotten out of control? Or is it going to more community problem solving, nonviolent conflict resolution, the kinds of things that are keeping us on the positive side of those vital signs, right? And so we look at those 5 things everywhere, and the reason I go into that is because one of the disturbing, interesting things over the last 15 years or so is you would think that democratic systems, this system and any country that has a democratic governance system, would automatically score higher on some of those, right? Like institutional legitimacy. If you get to elect your leaders, you'd think you'd feel more legitimacy in those institutions than if you were in a country where you don't get to elect them at all. Or agency. You know, if you get a vote, I assume you feel more agency than. What we've seen for the last 10 to 15 years is democratic systems, United States among them, but others as well, are not outperforming non-democratic systems on these 5 metrics that tell us whether a country is likely to slide into violence or not. And while we were developing and doing the research for this, and we consulted over 200 peer organizations, policymakers, we did focus groups in the countries where we work, including here as we were developing this. Just to bring this alive, there was an article that came out in the British medical journal, The Lancet, which is like an ancient journal, you know. And I don't read The Lancet, but the findings were so shocking to the researchers that this report, this study made mainstream news. I read about it in the Washington Post. And what the report was it was on the largest ever study of effective COVID response, a 177 country study. You can look it up. And they were judging an effective COVID response by 2 things, infection rate and death rate. And what they found is none of the things that they thought would correlate to an effective response did. The wealth of the country, the strength of the health infrastructure, the education level of the population, whether it was a democratic or an autocratic society. The things that correlated most to an effective COVID response was the levels of trust, intercommunal trust and trust for institutions. And those things did not correlate to any of those other measures. And so to your question, I can't tell you precisely where the country stands. I can tell you that you're not imagining what you're feeling. We are rapidly declining, as is the rest of the world, into an increasingly polarized state where we don't just have the diversity, we have the question of not only are you different from me, you're a threat. And that's a dangerous place to be. And if we're going to tackle it, I would advocate that we have to tackle it at the level of feeding those vital signs, not just protecting the institutions of democracy. As much as I want to protect the institutions of democracy, if it's not delivering for people, people will not believe in it. And you ask young people today, you take your survey you did yesterday, how many young people today will tell you there's no political solution to this or that issue? It's really very troubling. And so we have to tackle those issues at that level.
That was tremendously insightful, and I appreciate that context. I think it gives certainly me, and I think probably everybody, some food for thought, especially the fact that it is trust and confidence in institutions that ultimately, regardless of the political system, makes them work.
Trust in each other and in the institutions.
Each other and in institutions. You did mention one word I counted twice because it did set what little hair I have on my head up, which was the word decline. We are declining amongst all of these metrics. And I wonder, Mona, I'm going to go back to you on this one, are there certain things about American culture, American systems, do you think, that make us particularly vulnerable in terms of the way we view ourselves in a moment, an era of decline? Do you believe we are in a moment, an era of decline? And what does that mean for how we see ourselves? What is our future American identity when we have not always, but for most of our country's history, viewed ourselves as either a superpower since the end of the Second World War, or this concept of frontier and manifest destiny, that where our future was forward and great things were coming. The whole idea of America is built, the mythology of frontier is central to Americanness. What happens to a people 2.5 centuries into this when we're looking at all of these metrics and what we're seeing is, as Shamil pointed out, I think accurately, decline?
So we are in a moment where all of us, I think, in this room, can I do a quick poll? How many people would, if I asked you, you have confidence that your children's lives will be better than yours, how many would raise their hands? Okay, maybe a sixth, fewer, an eighth. We are in a real crisis of confidence about our society, and it is a moral and spiritual and information matter. It isn't grounded in reality. The fact is, we are wealthier and more secure than ever in history. People don't even recognize how much better off Americans are than even your average European. And the Europeans are very wealthy compared to the rest of the world. But Americans have incomes, have disposable income that is just, I mean, I know inflation is a problem, et cetera, but I'm just talking about in terms of the scheme of, in terms of the sweep of world history. There has never been a society that was wealthier, freer, and provided more opportunity. And yet, we are pessimistic, we are untrusting, we find ourselves governed by conspiracy theorists and other kinds of low-functioning types. And you have to say, what has happened to undermine, to undermine faith in knowledge, in the things that have created all of these miracles that we all enjoy? And for that, we have to turn to something I mentioned a second ago. We have to turn to information, because this is a new world. I was watching the other day a conversation between two former members of Congress. Both were sort of moderates from their respective states, and they were asked whether they thought they could make it in the environment now, and they said absolutely not. And the reason was that they, as a moderate, they would never have gotten, they would not today be able to get past a primary. Because of course the primaries are geared toward the most extreme members of both parties. But why are the voters in primaries so radical that they are looking, as somebody put it a few years, Mike, you'll know this quote, that it turns out the voters wanted the craziest son of a bitch they could find. And that, in all too many cases, is exactly true. Why is that? It's because of the information environment. That is the thing that is creating this new world that we are having so much trouble understanding, getting our arms around. It's because the constituencies that are in those Republican primaries and the people who are voting in Democratic primaries not only have different policy preferences and different value sets, perhaps, they don't live in the same information world at all. There's one truth as in one camp and a completely opposite one in the other. And so there is no shared reality anymore, and that is profoundly destabilizing for a society when you can't even agree. It's one thing to have a debate, but you can't even begin to have a debate until you have agreed upon facts. Sometimes. And we don't have that. And you know, with the arrival of the internet, has been the most disruptive force, more disruptive, I would say, than the discovery of nuclear weapons in terms of endangering the stability of the world.
That's a sobering thought, but I think it's probably accurate, right? Because the threat of nuclear annihilation, I think, at least brought us together, while the democratization of information balkanized us and further apart.
Yes.
You began, I think, with a really interesting assumption, which was that when we're talking about success, that standard is material success. And I think in many ways it begs the question, has our material success led to a lot of these problems without some other underlying characteristics to make us a happy people? And so, Shamil, I wanted to bring you back in really quickly on this, because I don't think there's any doubt, but I want your opinion. I don't think there's any doubt, but I want your opinion, Shamil, that the information ecosystem has made us largely more distrustful as a society. But what are you seeing in your data that trust in each other and in institutions across governmental systems? Have you found anything that is holding in certain societies that may not be in others?
Well, two things. One, we got some funding during COVID to support 11 governments that were in high conflict societies to respond to COVID, because the concern was they were going to have particular challenges, right? And we did a lot of work over a couple of years, and one of the findings that came out of some of that work that we were doing, very on-the-ground work between the communities, the governments, the international aid workers, who oftentimes didn't have the trust of either, and et cetera, was the people who were spreading misinformation about COVID. And in understanding why they were doing it, without going into all the details of it, the bottom line was that many of them didn't even believe it, what they were spreading. But they hated this government so much, and if it was going to put out that information, they were going to put out this information. It was very tribal. And so when you're dealing with conflict dynamics and polarization, totally agree with your point about we're not even agreeing on the same facts, right? It would be nice if we could agree on the same facts. What we found is that, unfortunately, trying to address that by presenting the facts is almost irrelevant. It's really about how people are feeling, about one another that will enable you to tackle this, to tackle this issue on disinformation. And I agree that media information ecosystem has become really challenging. So the only other thing I will mention to your point is, like, if you look at the demographic of people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th a few years ago, I think Robert Pape at the University of Chicago did the most in-depth research on them. They were not anywhere near the most destitute people in the country economically. And again, when I went to those 5 vital signs, I told you that one of them was a very subjective one about agency. One of the things that we found out about agency is that it doesn't correlate to things you might think it would. Like if you're poor, you feel less agency. There are oftentimes social networks in other societies, or tribal networks, where people feel like, you know what, there might be a corrupt government here, but I know I'll get justice through the tribal system. Or there's social networks that will take care of one another. And so sometimes these things, like, can't we agree on the same facts? Or, look, you're economically doing so much better than a lot of people, actually don't correlate to what drives people to act out, to see themselves in a desperate situation, to believe that they're in an existential risk from a growing minority, for instance, or whatever. Like, these are the kinds of things and so you've got to find a way to address where people are at. The first principle of any engagement in any kind of social change work is you meet people where they're at. You try to understand what's going on for them. And unfortunately or fortunately, that oftentimes doesn't relate to sort of factual data about income levels or about what's actually true about COVID or not.
I'm going to stitch that answer together. Eric, I want to come to you, because one of the things that I'm seeing as somebody who does a lot of polling regularly is that those Americans with the most negative view of this country and its future prospects, to Mona's point, this generation that has been, I think, undeniably the wealthiest, most prosperous, lived largely in a time of an era of peace, kind of have reaped the blessings of 10 generations of Americans, have the most negative view of Americans of any generation polled. A couple of exceptions. Black and Latino voters have higher levels of confidence in the American idea than wealthier, whiter, older, college-educated people. To your point, Shamil, about wealth not necessarily being correlates to this anger, this loss of whatever it is. Can communities of color teach us something about that community, that cultural unity that the rest of the country needs, especially when it has, for whatever reason, a more optimistic view of our country's future, despite a whole lot of reasons for it, I would argue, not to?
I think what it is a different baseline. I think that when we talk about, what is progress and what is advancement, this is an example, but during 2020 when the racial justice protests were happening, I remember having this conversation with my father, who is in his 80s, about this time is going to be different, and you see all the multicultural, there's so many people, and my dad's going, sure. And I remember having a conversation a couple of years later about, well, yeah, you're right. I think there is a level of this is America right now, and there's only the expectation of what can change is going to be a little bit different if you're a person of color, no matter your income or your class, than it is going to be if you're not. And I think to both of your points about, this is the wealthiest country, I think that we can't overlook the fact that there's a lot of people in this country where for generations they've been at roughly the same income level. They've been living in the same neighborhoods. They haven't really advanced all that much. And so this progress that we see in America over the last 50 years, they haven't seen it. That's as true as it is in parts of Appalachia as it is in South LA here. And so their expectations, they're angry, but their expectations are pretty set in a narrow wave, I think. Where other folks, their expectations are a bit wider, and when they don't get it, they're a lot more upset about that. So I think to answer your question, I guess yes, but saying somebody should lower their expectations is probably not, probably not what we want for America. But I do think that is why you see in that polling that you get.
Do Americans need to lower their expectations? Anybody, everybody? Or change them?
No, I think what Americans need to do is refocus on what makes for a happy and fulfilled human life. And for that, you need love and connection and a feeling of being seen and respected in your community. And those are exactly the things that you don't get through a screen. And this is an area where, at least somewhat, we are seeing glimmers of a sort of across-the-board recognition of a problem and a willingness to address it from both left and right, center, and any people all over the spectrum. Namely, we have agreed in an enormous number of states to take cell phones out of schools. And there's a recognition this is bad for kids. And so this is happening, and it's happening very, very rapidly. If that momentum could be extended to understanding what those screens are doing to us adults, we might be on the cusp of getting somewhere. Because the more that we can be in the same room with people, the more we can be, I hate this expression, but people use it, meat space, We're human, we're alive, we're living, breathing organisms, we're meat. And we need to be among one another. And the more time that, one of the organizations that I'm affiliated with is called More in Common, which is an effort to show advanced societies that what unites them is more important than what divides them. And recent polling that they have done shows that there is a direct correlation between time spent online and willingness to consider violence to settle political disputes. So that the more time you're online, the much more likely you are to say, yes, our problems are so severe that we have to take up arms. So hopefully, if there is hope, it's going to be a recognition about what screens and social media are doing to us.
Shamil, I'm going to again come back to you as our reference point on this, because I think that's exactly right. I think that is there any data from those countries that exhibit these higher levels of trust that show that they're less online? Are they less wealthy?
The tech issue is global. Tech platforms and the information ecosystem and the social media platforms are just they're more ubiquitous every day. So, I remember 7 years ago being in Mali, and I had meetings and ministers and partners or whatever. My last meeting was with about 25 youth activists right before I went to the airport. Our team had been working with these youth activists, really wonderful, extraordinarily ingenious and active. And I just asked them, what are you worried about? What are you dealing with? What's hard for you? They spent almost the entire time, this was so many years ago, talking about the challenges they were facing in dealing with what was happening on the anonymous WhatsApp platform, the recruitment by extremist groups of some of their peers, the spreading of misinformation, the scapegoating of minority communities, all this kind of stuff. So the answer to the question around, more or less online, it's really hard. I don't have a good answer to that, but the anecdotal evidence I could share with you is that all of the communities that we know around the world are struggling to deal with this. More autocratic systems are using some of these tools to assert more control. and more surveillance, and so you don't necessarily have as much of the peer usage to pull societies apart, but it's a real challenge. But I fear I fear like everything's so down. I do want to just
bring us up.
I do want to put a little bit, one of the things that I'll tell you a quick story that and then two principles that come out of it. So leading up to last year's very divisive presidential elections, one of the things our organization does in terms of our team, our work here in the US is we're sort of the backbone support for a coalition of organizations that each has the lead in a couple different states around the goal of trying to prevent political violence in those states, right? And so in addition to being the backbone support of this coalition, we have the lead in Pennsylvania and Texas. Okay, so what does that mean is that we do what we do anywhere around the world, which is that we identify and connect, we call them multi-partial coalitions, not impartial. We're not asking you to be neutral or no, actually your partiality is your strength. You have a constituency and a community that you represent and that trusts you, and that's good. You should bring that. You become really powerful when you combine that identity and that constituency with the others in your society. And when you can form that kind of multi-partial coalition, then you have certain superpowers. These are the groups that can say, look, don't use that word because, if we use that word, no one in my community is ever going to listen to us again. So let's just stop doing that, please. Or, if we make something happen in this neighborhood, all the doors will open to us. That's the most important neighborhood in my, and so we formed these coalitions, and so we're in Pennsylvania, and the first assassination attempt against then candidate and now President Trump happened at the Butler Fairgrounds in Western Pennsylvania. And that fireman was killed, and the Western Pennsylvania coalition that we've been working with, faith leaders, Chamber of Commerce folks, former veterans, bipartisan, multiracial, interfaith, immediately kicked into gear. And they just did a few things that I'm sure you didn't hear about, but this all happened within days of that assassination attempt. That attempt happened on a Saturday. By that, very late that night, the Christian leaders across that region all had talking points from this multi-faith coalition, which they could ignore if they wanted to, but if they wanted to address this with their congregations the next morning in a way that would bring their congregations together, that wouldn't heighten tensions, here are some ways they could think about doing it. A multi-faith coalition publicly went to the fairgrounds to reconsecrate the grounds for the purpose for which they'd been established, which was as a safe and fun community gathering place. A MAGA-endorsed state representative went on Truth Social and pushed back on the scapegoating of the Haitian community in Charleroi. And one of these talking head shows, these annoying get people beating each other up across Republican and Democratic lines with these sort of state political notables. For the first time, they changed the format of their show from a debate show to a dialogue, and the topic was on how to prevent further political violence. And then they did a trip around Pennsylvania and did talks. This all just mobilized out of one little coalition of people. And there's a saying in the humanitarian sector that you don't exchange business cards in the middle of a hurricane. It's helpful to have the relationships before things go bad. And one of the things that happens when things go bad, especially when it's around conflict, is that people retreat into where they feel safe. And if the only place you feel safe is the people who look like you or vote like you, that's what you're going to retreat into. That's very natural. But if you form these connections, and even if it's just one person, you retreat into one another. Are you okay? What are you hearing? What am I hearing? What could we do? Oh, I didn't even think about that, because you've got access to that community, and that's very invigorating and empowering. And any American can actually do that at the local community level, is identify. And I think one of the challenges is that the efforts to build bridges that explicitly invite people to bridge building are much less effective than the ones that listen to what people care about and identify the overlapping areas and invite them to that conversation. Even if you disagree on 50 things, but you all agree on 2, I'm going to organize a conversation about those 2 things. I'm not going to invite you to a how do we bridge divides conversation, because only the ones of you who, like me, make a living out of bridging divides are going to come, and we're not very interesting. And so, but we can all do that. But it's kind of like a sailboat. Like if you want to get there, if you point in that direction, you're never going to get there. You have to know where the wind's going and point in that direction, then you'll land there. And so you identify the things that people care about. Mona knows this, but effective politicians do this. They identify the overlapping issues. They build new constituencies in broader tents because they appeal to those core issues. And we can all do that in our activism, our local community, volunteerism, whatever we do.
I want to visit a little bit on mythology. as a part of American identity. And every national identity requires some mythology, some part of your origin story. And mythology isn't necessarily, fictionalized, although there's obviously some embellishment about how a people came to be. But there's three, it strikes me that there are at least three elements to the national American mythology that I think are coming under question at this moment. The idea of the founding, what the founding meant, that all men were created equal. The other is the mythology of the frontier and what opportunity meant, especially at a time in America where we are rapidly entering a phase where more Americans will have looked north, or their people will have looked north, or their people will have looked east for opportunity or frontier as opposed to looking west. What does that do to our national sense of understanding of ourselves? And then the third is this mythology of self-reliance. And again, that's not to say mythologies aren't true. There's an element to truth to it. But those three pieces specifically, there's obviously a lot more to it, but those three pieces I think are pretty commonly agreed upon that those are central to Americanness and American identity. Our founding, our foundational story, the framers, powdered wigs and all in a hot Philadelphia, building, the idea of frontier and going west, and then the idea of self-reliance, a country where anybody can make it. It feels to me that all three of those are being challenged in an unprecedented moment at this time. Am I wrong in feeling that? That's for I want everybody to address that a little bit.
So this is the most love that Frederick Jackson Turner and his essay, The Closing of the American West, has gotten in any panel that I've ever been on. The second time you've mentioned him, so I'm sure he's very gratified. If you don't mind, I'm going to approach this in a slightly different perspective. One of the things that I have experienced since the beginning of this whole Trump business is that because I had been a Republican, a conservative Republican, and hadn't really been in conversations that often, except on TV, which doesn't really count because those are gladiatorial contests, but in real conversations with people of differing views. And post-Trump, I was given many more opportunities to do that. And it was, I hope, productive. I believe productive. And one of the things that I found was a sticking point is that progressives, are very keen to make sure that American history is taught so that the suffering of slaves, the suffering of Native Americans is recognized and honored and not, whitewashed, if you forgive the expression. And that is completely understandable. At the same time, there is a tension because in communities where that's the sole emphasis about how you teach American history is all of the sins of the country, it's mistreatment of Native Americans, it's mistreatment of African Americans, it's mistreatment of women, etc., then how do you teach children to be proud of the country they've inherited if it's all sins? And I once wrote a column years ago where I said American history should be taught in a balanced way, virtues and all, right? So that you can acknowledge the hard part. But anyway, these conversations are a little bit fraught because people feel strongly, they have passionate views about it, and But for the American nation to cohere, it seems to me that we have to be able to come to some kind of agreement. And by the way, polling, again from More in Common, has shown that the vast majority of people in the middle are really in the middle. I mean, they do acknowledge that slavery and racism and Jim Crow are horrible stains on our history. Even most Republicans are perfectly happy to have that be part of the curriculum. But what they also want is to show that, we are a nation that learns from its mistakes, that we have tried to live up to the creed, always imperfectly, but we keep coming back to the founding documents and the founding principles of this country. And so it seems to me that this is a moment for trying to find that common ground, trying to not let that history be a source of division, but instead find the common ground to be able to unite around that story, especially with the 250th anniversary coming up.
I know I push back on that a little bit because I think that, first of all, some of the lessons about history, about slavery, about Native Americans, I think, first of all, you have to assume they're not even fully taught in schools. Like, that's number one. Like, as an adult, particularly somebody who moved from the Midwest to the West, what I've learned about American history just in moving to the other side of the Mississippi River is a lot. And so I think...
No, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it was true of me.
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, I think it's probably even more true today. But I think that, as far as like how we get pride out of that, I think that, for every person of color in this country who may or may not be down on this country, I think you can look around at your family and your community and see that progress. I think the missing component is the history. And I think one of the reasons why people really insist on having that history taught and being a part of this 250th, anniversary of America is that without that history, the current present doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. Why am I in this community? Why does my city look this way? Why does everybody I know in this situation? And I think that that's part of the reason why there's that pushback to have some of this. Dwelling on it might not be, the greatest thing in the world, but I think that it has to be a balance. But I don't think the balance that we have right now is the right balance, if that makes sense.
No, that's fair. As I said, it's a hard conversation. Mm-hmm. The tricky part is finding the right balance. But I think, and I wonder if you agree, that the balance is important, because if you tip too far in the direction of listing all the sins, you get Americans who don't even really see what the point is of caring about the country.
Sure, I mean, I definitely think that that's a part of it, but I don't think we've gotten to the point where we're listing all the sins. I don't think that I think we're only the tip of the iceberg about understanding the full measure of history in this country for a lot of people, not everybody. And I think that has been behind the push. I think, you saw it in 2020 when people started to learn, particularly younger people of color started to learn a little bit more about their own history. And they were like, I didn't know this. I didn't know that at all. I want to know more about that. I want to understand that. And I think you can't underestimate how much or overestimate how much people don't know about the history of this country.
Shamil, do you have any comments?
Yeah, it's interesting because, if you think about pretty much any war or any really traumatic event in the life of a polity, the sort of cheapest, the least expensive in terms of resources thing to do is also the one that always is the hardest and comes generations later. It's the issuing of a genuine and formal apology. Because that messes with people's notion of, wait, we're always the good guys, aren't we? Was it Reagan that apologized for the internment camps in here? Or after the nuclear, I forget when.
Second World War.
The Japanese American.
Well, the Japanese American, but then also the apology for the atomic bomb. Anyway, it's always the case that the psychic toll and the mythology would like to keep, it keeps us from doing the one thing. People will pay billions of dollars of reparations before they will issue a formal apology. And I think this goes to the dialogue that the two of you are having, which I think is really fascinating, which is that there's some, and kind of Mona, you were saying people really need to be heard and respected, right? Like, this is one of the things that we see a lot, is that if you want to determine what's most likely to make you or anybody feel comfortable, participating in a diverse conversation with a diverse group or being a member of a diverse community. It is not the experience, the critical threshold experience for you to have is not the experience of being agreed with by other people. That's actually irrelevant. It's the experience of being heard and respected. Maybe even more so when you're not agreed with. You say something, I totally disagree with you. I'm even frankly a little offended by what you said, but I really want to understand where you're coming from. You know, have you had personal experiences that make you feel that way? Or where do you get your information from? Where do I get it from? You know, people who go through that threshold experience of being heard and respected, like people who get a genuine apology, who are much less likely to sue for damages, you know, those things are really critical. So when I look at kind of what you were talking about, I couldn't agree more with you. Like even for me, my parents were immigrants, and so they did everything they could, like a lot of immigrant families, to get my brother and myself to the best education system possible. I grew up in a very privileged part of this country. I grew up in Fairfield County, Connecticut, right? Great education system. After the Black Lives Matter movement exploded, I learned a lot more just through books that people were recommending. I was like, my goodness, like, you know, about the Reconstruction era, about what happened, like, you know, and so, but this balance that you're talking about, Mona, I think is true. So at the level of communities, are there processes we can have that enable people to feel heard and respected about where they've come from, what their families have been through, and then pivot that conversation at some point to what monument do we want to have here that would make us all feel really proud and feel like we're part of this community? What, you know, because tearing down the old system is never the same thing as building the next system, right? And so, but you can't just skip over the past, you know, because people are going to be hurting with it, and they will find ways to insist on it if you keep denying it, right? Anybody will. That's what hurt is. So you're not trying to drive a community to feel shame. That's never a helpful emotion. But unmitigated pride, ignoring historical harms, is also not. So finding processes that enable people to tell their stories, to be heard telling their stories, and then to pivot together to identifying what do we want to do here? What do we want next? What would be meaningful to us? What monument would I'd love to see in the central square or whatever? I think those are the kinds of processes that we need to get at this difficult dynamic, because I don't think it's a scientific, like, this is how much acknowledgement you need to do. It's a very human thing.
I have been a very bad moderator because I got wrapped up in the conversation and I let this discussion go on a little bit too long. We're going to take questions from the audience. Do we want to just do it, John, by a show of hands? If there's questions, yes. Or, oh, there's a microphone. So stand up and go to the microphone. Mimi, is that how we do it? There's microphones on both sides, I guess. I'm sorry, I apologize. If you stand up and kind of walk to the microphones on either side, you can go ahead and ask your questions. So, yes, sir.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, my name's Peter Scaria. I teach political science at Boston College, far, far away. I'd like to ask the panel as a whole why, among all the problems that we faced that were mentioned, and I don't dispute any of them, none of you mentioned the enormous growth in disparate wealth in the United States or globally. But I didn't hear one mention of the enormous growth in wealth inequality in the United States, which I think helps to explain some of what we're experiencing.
So I actually would push back. I'm not sure that, and I'd love to hear your view of where you see that in action, because the different tribes, the different hatreds, the different divisions that I see in our society seem to cut across different classes and races, and it doesn't really feel to me, and maybe I've missed something, but it doesn't really feel to me as if we have a huge amount of anger coming from people who have seen the growth of the ultra-rich. Now, bearing in mind that, you know, people have a lot of problems with Elon Musk, and that's a separate thing, and the tech bros, but the wealth inequality, I just haven't seen that being played out.
Should I try to respond? Well,
I do. Before you do, I do want to mention the reason why I didn't tackle this issue specifically is because we're trying to focus on how this creates an American identity, right? And if what you're suggesting is that split and that division, this wealth inequality, is part of challenging American identity, American fairness, American self-reliance, that would be kind of where I was kind of going with this. But by all means,
Sure, I think I can tap into that
Yeah,
scenario.
please.
And to respond to Mona Sharon's question, clearly, large segments of the American public that support President Trump clearly feel that they have not only been disrespected and neglected culturally, but their ability to prosper and to make a decent living and to pass it on to their kids is not clear to them. And I think the data, which I'm not prepared to cite chapter and verse for you, I think the data bear that out. And I'm surprised that you don't see that.
Well, at the risk of, I don't want to, just take up all the time on this, but I actually think I would love to see the data that you're referring to.
Mm-hmm.
From what I can gather, the people who vote Republican, yes, there has been an influx of some blue-collar people into the Republican camp, but there's still huge numbers of Republican voters, most of them actually, who are above the median income. I don't see this as a class war thing, but anyway, I don't want to
I'm not just talking about Republican voters, though, but we'll have to try to continue.
So, I will say, I think, to the backlash to the Democratic Party specifically, people not voting Democrat, I do think you do see some of that class warfare in that, where you feel that, Democrats have aligned themselves with the elites, quote unquote, and that there is more of a sense of we only care about wealth. I think that maybe in communities of color, particularly in some of the conversation before the election about the price of eggs and all of the economic stuff, I do think there was an aspect to that of people feeling like I'm not getting mine, but this group of people over there is economically more solid. And I do think that one of the things that's happening now since Trump is in office, and we see, assuming people are paying attention and through the right information ecosystem, but we're seeing this consolidation of wealth among the wealthiest Americans. I do think that income inequality, which I will say, at least in California, you cannot ignore it because it's everywhere here, that will become a bigger issue, I think, particularly, hopefully in the midterms, but maybe in the next election, because we've seen more of that consolidation, and maybe, what you're saying, maybe more people will begin to care if they don't already.
Sure.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, guys. That was really a super insightful discussion already. So we're at a university, so I'm going to ask a university question. And even though you guys aren't university professors, maybe you're the best people to talk about this. So I'm just kind of interested in the role of college and universities in all of this. We're at a kind of interesting time where universities are at sort of an all-time low in respect and trust. But if you look at the voting patterns, right, there's this huge gap that college-educated people voted for, against Trump and at a much higher rate, right? And so it's interesting, and people are telling their kids not to go to. You hear even major leaders telling people not to go to college. Of course, I think it's a vital part of people's, growth as a human. But I'm just curious. It's also an identity, and I wonder. I think increasingly people identify as college educated or not, and I feel that coming on stronger. I'm just kind of curious at any of your comments about what role it plays in the problem, maybe what role it plays in the solution.
I mean, one of the challenges I see is the way in which the country is physically self-segregating. When the French social scientist de Tocqueville came to this country in the early years of the Republic and was commenting on what made this system seem really unique and vibrant and exciting, he didn't write about the system of checks and balances or the institutions. He talked about this thing he called civil society, and how weird it was that these different citizens came across different identity lines, and they would form associations on this common issue, and then they'd form different associations on that common issue, and it was this vibrant coming together across differences based on shared interests or whatever it might be. And the less and less we're living in proximity to one another across some of these political divides or other divides, the harder that seems to be. And the university continues to be one of, unfortunately, a dwindling number of places where, at least in theory, that's still happening. You can have people from for a lot of young people, I think, who do go to university, it's the most diverse community they've ever been a part of. Ideologically, racially, from a religious perspective, rural, but whatever it is, like for a lot of them. And so for that reason alone, I think the university has a huge role to play. And going again along one of the challenging things is, these last 20 years, I don't think that our young people have seen healthy models of conflict resolution or dialogue at almost any level of society. Certainly not in our politics, and certainly not in the online ecosystem that they've all grown up as sort of natives of that system, right? And so your university leadership are getting these young people on campus who may or may not have actually had a lot of positive experience across different, haven't seen it modeled, but the university could be a great place to foster that in people, to enable that kind of thing. If I were in a position to make decisions in a university or a college setting, I would look at the dividing lines that very predictably fracture. The Hillel Association and the Muslim Students Association, the Young Republicans and the Young Democrats, you take any of the issues, right? And I would really try to get the student leadership of these things in common. Again, not bridge building. On whatever ad hoc committee you have, we need a new meal plan at UCI. We're going to put you guys on the same committee to advise us. We need to figure out how to foster a healthier social. Let's get young people across their dividing lines working in common cause on things that aren't the hottest issue that divides them, and enable them to model and experience that. I'd love to see a lot more of that. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of places physically, and even our social media ecosystems are fracturing between Blue Sky over here and Twitter here and whatever. So I think university, it might be a quaint view, but I think universities have a really vital role to play in that way.
I completely agree with what Shamil said, and I would go a little further, though, and just say that I do think universities need to use this moment when they are so under attack by the government to genuinely reform themselves, and it's unfortunate that it is being done at the point of a gun. It really is. I mean, I find that reprehensible and un-American, and hopefully, and I believe illegal, but we'll see about that. What Trump is doing by punishing universities is just, it violates free expression, free association, etc. That said, the university, for example, Columbia University, rather than permitting classes to be disrupted, students to be harassed and in some cases injured by pro-Gaza protesters last year, should have done what a university is supposed to be best at doing, which is fostering dialogue, showing respect for each side, and not like, well, they could have had formal debates instead of sit-ins, but actually I think private conversations would have been better, where there's no audience to play to, where you bring people together in small groups and force them to see the humanity of the other. It's a microcosm of what we're facing in general in our society, where the polarization and the hatred is off the charts. And so I would love to see universities fulfill that function better. I think they have reformed a bit this year. It's been much better. But also in terms of the politics of universities, there has been a kind of monoculture that has grown up, not at all schools, I should say, but at many, and it's certainly among the elite colleges. It is a bit of a monoculture. It is kind of woke, and there are a lot of university professors, including, I can't remember his first name right now, Roth at Wesleyan, who has argued that universities should voluntarily try to hire more professors who have conservative or Christian or whatever, viewpoints, to balance things out a little bit. So I don't see any, I think that would be helpful for the universities to do, but unfortunately, it is awfully difficult to do it when you're being, when there's a gun in your back.
Time for one last question, sir.
Sorry to end that. So I was not surprised by Shamil's discussion about trust and the rapid decline of trust, because trust, some great books on speed of trust, that it takes years to inculcate trust in minutes for it to diminish. And the one thing that the fundamental behind that trust has got to be truth. And what I worry about is that there is no common truth, right? We've lost that. We used to have sources that we considered common truth, and today we don't. It's just noise. How do we ever bring a society together when we have such a fractured view of what the truth is?
My wife is one of the leading public intellectuals on what leads people down extremist rabbit holes. She's just came out with her 7th book. It was like her first or second book. She did a lot of research in Germany on the efforts that the German government was making to combat the rise of the neo-Nazi movement and the radical right. And she did hours and hours, hundreds of hours of observations in vocational schools, where there's a fair number of the students who are in and out or very much in the far right scene. And so she was researching how, one of the things that the government was doing that tended to backfire was, an older generation German professor would get up and say, hey, look, take a look at this data of, all of the immigrants and the children of immigrants who are feeding into the social safety net that takes care of all of us. Like, how they're contributing and what a vital part of the society are. My wife would do interviews with the students afterwards. And the kids who were immigrants or the children of immigrants who were sympathetic to them got what the professor was trying to say. And the other kids got out of the very same data, you see this? One of them, I'll never forget, said, we're going to end up like the Native Americans on reservations. We're becoming a smaller and smaller part of the society. One of the challenges with facts is that people immediately take the very same fact and use it to justify or inform their pre-existing worldview, even if they believe completely opposite things. And so that is not a case against truth. Trust me, like in today's society, especially, but I think at least as important as what are the facts here is our bringing ourselves into, I know I keep saying, but like sort of bringing ourselves into relationship with one another across our dividing lines and figuring out what do we want to be together? What do we want the society to be? Not to say truth doesn't matter, but just recognizing that when you share, like one last example of this, if you, and this research was done and then YouTube has used these pop-up ads as a result, if somebody searches something like white heritage, which can be a buzz term for how the extreme right movement tries to get people, instead of white supremacy, everybody gets to celebrate their heritage, we should be able to celebrate white heritage, right? So you search white heritage, you're very likely to get a pop-up ad that is part of this pre-bunking methodology. What they recognize is that sharing counterfactuals doesn't work once somebody goes down a rabbit hole of this kind of extremist thinking, but what nobody likes is being manipulated. And so giving them a dose and an example of the pattern by how you get manipulated. How does the dairy industry convince you that you need milk when actually you don't? How does the sugar industry manipulate you into buying more chocolate? Whatever. And what they've shown, and this has been very well demonstrated, is that when people see the pattern of that kind of manipulation, they're not inoculated completely, they're much less likely to buy into other kinds of conspiratorial thinking and that kind of stuff. And so when you search certain things on YouTube, because this research was done in collaboration with them, up will pop an ad that sort of gives you a little bit of that pre-bunking, 30-second video or whatever. That is not saying we shouldn't care about the facts, we shouldn't share, but it is recognizing that what drives our behaviors is not what is true. What drives our behaviors is how we feel. And so you've got to tap into that somehow.
Shamil, Erica, Mona, thank you so much.
So how about that? We just talked about some of the most controversial, divisive issues that faced this country. No one called each other a name. There were no fights that broke out. It's really a model for what we need in the country going forward. Think about what we talked about. What the American identity is, how it was created, whether it's based in myth or not, why it may be fracturing, and how to fix it. There's a lot here that becomes a model for the way the rest of the country can behave. And particularly here in a purple county, we have an opportunity to set an example for others, and not just for the rest of the country, but for that next generation. So I often ask people, generally people over 35, when was the last time you remember Democrats and Republicans being able to talk to one another in a time where they were respectful to one another? And most people will tell me 2012. They remember Obama and Romney running against one another, and they were fairly respectful to one another. Right? So that's 13 years ago. Think how old a freshman in college was at that point. The model we have given them most of their lives so far, this next generation, is of one of division. And that is exactly the reason that the School of Social Ecology is leaning into these events and this future of dialogue during this time of disruption. We hope that many of you will come back for additional sessions in the future. We hope that many of you, like our good friend Dr. Kim, will want to help support this. But most importantly, I hope that you'll continue to practice this in your own lives. So with thanks to the Aspen Institute as well, and to our moderator, Mike Madrid, and the rest of our panelists, please join me in thanking them for a really rousing conversation.